When a dismissive avoidant attachment dynamic reaches the point where both people stop reaching out, something very specific begins to unfold. It doesn't begin with drama or closure. It begins with silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels empty, heavy in its own way. Two people, each carrying their own emotional wounds, each protecting themselves through different survival strategies, suddenly stop trying to connect. The messages slow down, then disappear. The calls stop coming. The familiar cycle of closeness followed by distance, of reaching out and pulling away, finally breaks apart and dissolves into nothing. At first, it feels like this silence must be the ending, like the story has simply closed. But for both you and the dismissive avoidant, it isn't really an ending. It's the beginning of something far more uncomfortable, something that forces reflection. Because when neither person is chasing anymore, what remains isn't peace, it's reality. For the dismissive avoidant, the withdrawal is rarely rooted in dislike or emotional coldness. More often, it's about protection and control. Distance becomes a strategy. If they stay emotionally removed, they believe they can avoid vulnerability, avoid rejection, and avoid revisiting old emotional pain they've learned to suppress. But when you also stop reaching out, something shifts in that internal system they rely on. At first, there is relief, a sense of quiet. No emotional demands, no expectations, no pressure to respond or engage. It feels like control has been restored. But that feeling doesn't last. As time passes, that relief slowly transforms into something else. Curiosity, then confusion. The silence they once used as a shield starts to echo in a different way. It becomes noticeable, disruptive. A question begins to form in their mind. Why aren't they reaching out anymore? For someone with a dismissive avoidant style, connection has always been complicated. There is a deep internal contradiction. They want closeness, but they also fear it. Intimacy feels safe and threatening at the same time. Love is desired, but also associated with loss of independence, emotional overwhelm, or past hurt. So when you used to consistently reach out, it created a predictable emotional structure. Even if they pulled away, they knew the connection still existed. They knew you would return. That reassurance allowed them to keep distance without fully confronting loss. But when you stop contacting them as well, that structure collapses. Now they are no longer the one managing distance. They are no longer in control of the emotional rhythm. Instead, they are left sitting in uncertainty, trying to understand a silence they didn't expect. That's where the internal conflict begins. Meanwhile, you go through your own emotional process. At first, there is resistance. The urge to reach out doesn't disappear immediately. It lingers. You catch yourself checking your phone more than you want to admit. You wonder if they'll break the silence. You wonder if your absence might finally make them come closer. But then, something shifts with time. The emotional intensity starts to fade, even if slowly. And in its place comes a different feeling, clarity. You begin to notice how much energy was invested into something that was never fully mutual, how much emotional space they occupied in your mind, how often you adjusted yourself just to keep the connection alive. And slowly, the silence changes meaning. What once felt like rejection starts to feel like distance that protects you, space that returns you to yourself. Piece by piece, you begin to reconnect with your own emotional center. And while you are moving inward and regaining clarity, something else is happening on the other side as well. The dismissive avoidant begins to sense the shift too, not through conversation, but through absence itself. They may never consciously acknowledge it, but on a deeper emotional level, They can sense when you start pulling away. That invisible thread they once relied on for reassurance begins to feel loose. And that shift creates something unsettling inside them. Fear. Not always obvious at first, but present underneath the surface. The same fear they've spent most of their life trying to avoid. The fear of being forgotten, of not being needed, of losing emotional control. Dismissive avoidant individuals often build their identity around independence. They tell themselves they don't need anyone, that distance is safer, that emotional detachment is strength. But when the person who once consistently cared finally goes silent, it activates the very thing they've been suppressing, the feeling of abandonment they were trying to outrun. At this point, they rarely confront it directly. Instead, their behavior becomes indirect, almost subtle. They start observing from a distance, checking your stories, liking something you posted long ago, sending something small and casual, like a meme or a light message that doesn't require emotional depth. It's not random, it's testing. They are trying to feel out the space between you, trying to understand if the connection still exists, if you're still emotionally available, if there's still access without the risk of vulnerability. It's their quiet way of asking, "Are you still there? Do I still matter to you?" But here's where the dynamic becomes complicated. If you respond too quickly, they feel that emotional closeness returning, and their instinct is to retreat. If you don't respond at all or stay emotionally distant, they begin to feel uncertain, even unsettled, as if they are losing grip on something they assumed was always there. This creates an internal push and pull that neither side fully controls. Once the contact stops completely, time becomes the real force that reveals everything. Days turn into weeks, and weeks into months, and slowly, both of you start seeing the situation more clearly, without emotional intensity clouding the judgment. You begin to recognize how much of your energy was invested in trying to maintain something that required constant emotional effort. The need to fix, to explain, to prove your value, to earn consistency from someone who was never fully emotionally available in the first place. And on the other side, the dismissive avoidant begins to feel the weight of their own emotional patterns. The silence they once used for protection becomes uncomfortable. Because when everything goes quiet, there is no distraction left. Only thoughts they've avoided sitting with. Loneliness starts to surface. So does regret. And with it, the quiet realization that real connection requires something they've consistently struggled with: vulnerability. For some dismissive avoidants, this stage becomes emotionally difficult to ignore. They start replaying memories of the connection. Not just the surface-level moments, but the feeling you brought into their life, the warmth, the patience, the emotional steadiness they didn't fully appreciate at the time. In their mind, the connection may even become idealized. But even with that reflection, pride often holds them back. Outwardly, they convince themselves they are fine, that they've moved on, that distance was the right choice. Yet in quieter moments, late at night, when everything slows down, those defenses weaken and memories return. Your voice, your reactions, your presence, the way you made space for them emotionally. And underneath it all, a subtle emotional discomfort remains. Not easily named, but deeply felt. It isn't just nostalgia. It's recognition of what was present and what was lost because of fear. Meanwhile, your experience begins to shift in a different direction. The emotional dependence starts to fade. The urgency to check, to wait, to anticipate their response slowly loses intensity. And in its place comes awareness, clarity. You start seeing the relationship not through hope, but through truth. You realize how much emotional labor you were carrying alone. How often you were reaching into a space that wasn't fully meeting you back. And slowly, Silence stops feeling like punishment. It starts feeling like information, not closure in the way you expected, but closure in the way reality provides. It shows you what they can offer, and just as importantly, what they consistently cannot. And once that realization settles in, something fundamental changes. The need for their attention weakens, and for the first time, your focus shifts back to where it was always supposed to be: your own energy, your own peace, and your own emotional stability. Months later, when the silence has stretched long enough to feel permanent, something often shifts again. The dismissive avoidant may reappear. Sometimes it's subtle, a simple, "Hey, how have you been?" out of nowhere. Sometimes it's indirect, a reaction to your story, a like on an old post, or a small interaction that looks casual on the surface. And other times it feels more intentional, like a message that carries unspoken weight beneath relaxed words. But rarely is it ever just small talk. It's testing. Testing whether access still exists. Testing whether emotional space is still available. Testing whether the connection can be reopened without directly confronting vulnerability. Because underneath the distance and detachment, dismissive avoidants still carry emotional needs like everyone else. The difference is, they struggle to express them in a stable, direct way. Instead, they approach connection cautiously, indirectly, and often inconsistently. And when they sense you've genuinely moved forward, something deeper gets activated. Not always immediately visible, but internally disruptive. The realization that the person who once showed emotional presence, patience, and consistency is no longer emotionally available in the same way. That can trigger discomfort, sometimes even insecurity. If you respond from a healed emotional state, the dynamic feels noticeably different. The charm may still be there, the familiarity may still exist, but it no longer has the same pull over you. What once felt emotionally mysterious now feels familiar in its pattern, predictable, recognizable. You begin to see the cycle clearly: the approach, the distance, the reappearance, the withdrawal. And with that clarity comes something important: emotional detachment from confusion. You no longer interpret inconsistency as depth. You see it for what it is. And in that moment, real internal power emerges. Not because you're ignoring them, not because you're trying to prove a point, but because you're no longer emotionally dependent on their behavior to feel stable. At that point, healing stops being about reunion. It becomes about recognition. Recognizing the pattern, recognizing what it cost you, and recognizing that peace cannot grow in an environment where fear controls connection. The most overlooked shift happens when your silence is no longer strategic or emotional. It becomes natural, a result of self-respect, not reaction. And that kind of silence carries a completely different weight. To the avoidant, it doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like absence, real absence. The kind that signals you are no longer waiting, no longer available in the same emotional way, no longer orbiting around uncertainty. And that shift can be unsettling for them, not because they've lost control, but because they are confronted with something they are not used to facing: emotional finality. For some dismissive avoidants, this becomes a turning point. Your absence starts reflecting back their own attachment patterns. The discomfort they feel can slowly push them toward introspection. Why closeness feels threatening, why they withdraw when things get real, why connection often turns into distance. But this is not guaranteed, and it doesn't happen quickly. In other cases, the opposite happens. They double down on avoidance. They distract themselves. They move into work, new connections, or constant activity to avoid sitting in emotional stillness. But even then, unresolved feelings don't disappear. They linger underneath the surface until they are eventually faced. So when both people stop contacting each other, what unfolds is not just about who returns first. It's about what each person becomes in the silence. For you, it becomes awareness, self-respect, emotional clarity. For them, it becomes confrontation with their own internal patterns, whether they choose to face it or avoid it again. Sometimes, silence leads to reconnection, but only when both individuals have genuinely grown beyond their old patterns. Other times, it becomes a quiet ending, one that doesn't need explanation, because understanding has already replaced confusion. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether they still think about you, the honest answer is yes. At times, they likely do. But a more important question begins to matter more. Whether you are still thinking about yourself with the same emotional attention you once gave them. Because the real shift happens when your focus stops revolving around absence and returns to presence. Your own life, your own direction, your own emotional stability. That's when silence stops being something heavy and starts becoming something freeing. Not a space of loss, but a space of clarity. Because silence doesn't end meaningful connections. It exposes whether they were ever balanced enough to survive without constant pursuit. In the end, everything comes down to what the silence truly reveals. When two people stop reaching out, especially in a dynamic shaped by a dismissive avoidant attachment style, it can initially feel like abandonment, confusion, or emotional loss. But as time passes, that same silence begins to shift in meaning. It stops being just emptiness between two people and starts becoming a mirror. A reflection of patterns, fears, needs, and truths that were always there, just hidden beneath emotional intensity. For the dismissive avoidant, silence often removes the structure they unconsciously relied on. At first, it feels like relief, less pressure, less emotional demand, more control. But over time, that control is replaced by something harder to manage: awareness. The absence of consistent connection begins to surface thoughts they usually avoid. Questions about closeness, loss, emotional safety, and whether pushing people away actually protects them or quietly costs them connection. For the other person, the one who once reached, tried, and held things together emotionally, silence goes through its own transformation. What begins as pain slowly turns into reflection. Then, reflection turns into clarity. You start seeing the imbalance, the emotional effort that was not being matched, and the way your energy was repeatedly invested into uncertainty. And from that clarity, something important begins to grow: self-return. As both sides move through the silence, something powerful happens that neither fully controls. The emotional dependency starts to dissolve. The need for answers weakens. The urge to chase fades. And what replaces it is awareness, not just of the other person, but of yourself. Sometimes, this silence leads to reconnection, but only when both individuals have grown beyond their old emotional patterns. When avoidance is no longer leading the dynamic, and when attachment is no longer driven by fear. In those rare cases, silence becomes a bridge rather than an ending. But more often, silence becomes something else entirely: a conclusion without words, a quiet separation where understanding replaces confusion and acceptance replaces expectation. And this is the deepest truth hidden inside all of it. Silence does not destroy connection. It reveals its structure. It shows whether the bond was built on mutual emotional presence or on imbalance, pursuit, and fear. It exposes what was real, what was fragile, and what was never fully stable to begin with. For one person, silence becomes awakening, an emotional return to self-worth, boundaries, and inner stability. For the other, it becomes confrontation with avoidance, vulnerability, and the emotional patterns they have carried for years. But for both, if growth happens, silence is never wasted. It becomes a turning point, a space where emotional reality finally becomes visible without distortion. And in the end, the most important shift is not whether they come back, or whether they reach out first. It is whether you come back to yourself, because when you stop measuring your value through someone's absence or presence and start grounding yourself in your own emotional clarity, the entire meaning of the story changes. What once felt like loss becomes understanding. What once felt like waiting becomes release. And what once felt like silence becomes freedom. That is where the real conclusion lies. Not in reunion or distance, but in the moment you no longer need either to feel whole.